So let's continue our discussion of some background information of this war conflict, the Vietnam War. So our next point was about the Americans using chemical warfare, including napalm and Agent Orange. So napalm was a way they would drop it by bombs or use sort of flamethrowers, and they hoped to sort of clear large sections of the jungle and eliminate the Viet Cong soldiers. So they used sort of they dropped bombs filled with napalm, and they said over 8 million tons of bombs were dropped over Vietnam. And the effects were obviously very destructive. And if napalm gets on your body, it burns. So the burns that are accrued from napalm are, this is a quote, unbearably painful and almost always cause death among its victims. So it's a very, very painful way to die. Agent Orange was a very, very toxic chemical herbicide that was sprayed over the jungles in order to clear areas. And the bad thing about this herbicide was that it was had long-lasting damaging effects long after the war was over on people and animals. So, there were, cases of cancer, birth defects, and, damage, long-term damage caused by the use of the chemical warfare that was used in Vietnam by the American forces. Our next point here is that it was a very controversial war. So it started off, quite in sort of grassroots level, but there was sort of opposition to the war on college campuses across the United States. And, there were, people calling for peace, and a lot of sort of intellectuals, leftist intellectuals were opposing the war, and said that American they have no rights to get involved in this Vietnam conflict. So these marches and protests began sort of in the late 60s, so from 1965 on, and they sort of grew more and more news reports about deaths that were occurring, and a lot of people were just, overwhelmed with the sadness of all these young men being called into service. Often, this is not a voluntary draft, so all these young men between 18 and 25, they would have been called to service. And again, it was a very conflicting time in terms of being an American. So do you follow the political movement to support your country's war efforts, or do you follow your sort of moral sense or ethical feelings that we shouldn't be involved at all? So there was this sort of moral dilemma that many people faced, and more people grew disillusioned with the American involvement. And these demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations, grew and grew. And then you had, more influential people speaking out against the war. Martin Luther King was one of them. So as the death toll grew, there was more and more dissent at home. And this had, political consequences. So by 1970, Richard Nixon was in the White House, and he, uh, sort of influenced by public opinion, started to pull out American troops, and then eventually North Vietnam was successfully able to overtake the South Vietnamese army, and all the American troops were removed. And then eventually, with North Vietnam taking over the South Vietnam, unifying both territories, the former largest city in Vietnam, Saigon, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the leader, communist leader of the Viet Cong. So all this sort of background information sort of gives us a little bit more insight into some of the conflicts faced by uh, the characters in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And in particular, it sort of gives us a little bit more insight into how the soldiers themselves even felt conflicted about their involvement. So you can imagine yourself, you're getting ready for to enter university. You have all your plans, your aspirations for your life, and then one morning, rather than buying your textbooks for that year, you see in the mail a piece of uh, stationery saying that you should, or that you are now being enlisted in the war. So put yourself in that mindset, and uh, you're an 18-year-old, your whole life is ahead of you, and here you are being drafted against your will into military service. So it is a very sort of conflicting um, uh, uh, place to be in, and gender also is integral to that conflict, as we'll see in some of the stories in the O'Brien's text. So let's get a little bit more into some of these stories. So there are some repeated sort of themes or motifs throughout the things they carried. So the short stories do deal with a lot of sort of um, thematic elements of war narratives that we've seen in some of the other texts that we've also studied. The first theme that I want us to look for is this idea of trauma, the traumatic effects of war. So you can understand trauma as being, not just physically being harmed. Obviously, being wounded in war would be a traumatic event, but there is also an emotional or psychological trauma of being in an environment where at any moment your life could be taken away. And you're also the witness of murder. Um, the men, your friends who are there one day, are not there the next, right? Because something went wrong. Someone stepped on a booby trap, and then in a second, their life is over. So you can think about the traumatic situation of war, but also the after effects of that. So, as we know, post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the realities of being involved in warfare. And for some of the characters, they struggle long after. Even Tim O'Brien, the fact that he feels so compelled to tell his stories of what happened suggests that there is a need for repetition, a way of mastering events of the past that are not fully resolved, or that continue to haunt one long after the event is over. So we can look for evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder as it's conveyed by the characters and by the narrator, Tim O'Brien. So we'll look for that. The second theme would be the realities of war. And what I mean by that is just the way that Tim O'Brien is able to convey the gritty horror of warfare. So he doesn't sort of candy coat or whitewash or glorify war in any regard. And there's an interesting quote, if you're interested in this topic. One of the most, difficult stories to read, I would say, was How to Tell a True War Story. And in it, this is a quotation, so he says, "A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger wastes, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil." So that was on page 76 in the short story, How to Tell a True War Story. So he does convey sort of the gritty realities of war, the ambiguity, how obscenity and evil are sort of part of every side. It can't be simplified down to a kind of good versus evil. It's all gray area. Um, Morally, neither side is good, and there is death of innocent lives on both sides. So it's a lot more complicated than often the rhetoric or propaganda of political parties sort of convey it as. The third theme that will be sort of illustrated in the short stories is this the necessity of storytelling, and I mentioned this briefly, but this idea that storytelling can become healing, something that helps one cope with harsh realities and deal with trauma as well. So if you think about the function of storytelling as a way to make sense of the past, to connect all those little fragments and horrifying glimpses into something that has maybe a little bit more meaning or cohesion. So for somebody who is traumatized, the process of beginning to tell it as a story gives one a sense of sort of coping or dealing or healing from that past. And we'll get that with the narrator, Tim O'Brien, who will talk about this idea of storytelling and how we shape the past and keep even those who have lost their lives, we keep them alive in a certain way by telling stories about them. So at the very end of the book, in The Lives of the Dead, Tim O'Brien will discuss how stories can save us, right? So even if you have friends and family who are no longer alive, we use stories as a way to keep their memories alive and in a way give them life again. And it also helps sustain us as well. Another theme is this moral ambiguity. So like I said before, the simplified version, the political rhetoric of good and evil, those lines are constantly being blurred. So the American troops aren't the heroes, the aren't the sort of there is a sort of political rhetoric in especially American politics where the American troops are always cast as sort of the bringers of justice, the bringers of democracy, the morally righteous heroes. But this ambiguity is evident in the Vietnam War, especially where a lot of American civilians felt that their country wasn't justified in getting involved with Vietnam. So there is a moral ambiguity to Tim O'Brien's narrative.